First we'll hear Torben Andersen, Professor of Economics at Aarhus University. He has a long background in policy advice. He's been the chairman of the Danish Economic Council, among other things. Commenting on Torben's speech, we have Lars Calmfors, Professor of Economics at Stockholm University. Lars also has a very long background in policy advice. He's a former chairman of the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council, among many other previous experiences. Welcome, Torben.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to come here today and speak about some of the big issues in relation to the Nordic or Scandinavian or Swedish welfare model, if you want. So I've been asked to sort of give this more broad perspective on this model and why it works, and put it in some perspective. So the big question is, of course, how a big welfare state, an extended welfare state, affects economic performance. And the Nordic countries, they often stand out in international comparisons, and there's also often pointed to as examples of countries which have managed to have, on the one hand, an extended welfare state, but also well-functioning economies, very high income levels, reasonably equal distribution of income, and so on. So that's often pointed to as examples showing how to sort of square the concern about, on the one hand, economic efficiency, and on the other hand, social concerns. And I think recent developments in Europe, the discussion about social pillar in the EU and so on, see increasingly people pointing to the Nordic countries as examples of how to try to balance these things. I do not mean to imply that everything is perfect in the Nordic countries. Of course, we have many challenges and we have many issues to deal with, but of course, in a comparative perspective, we do stand out. But that, of course, immediately also raises the question: what is on the agenda? What are the challenges, and so on? If we're going to maintain this position in a forward perspective, I'll not talk so much about this, but it will sort of be behind some of the points I'll be making. Now, of course, we could have a long discussion about the concept of a welfare state and how we should define it, and I'll not go deep into that, but just mention a few key characteristics. One is that if we think of the Nordic welfare model, that we have as a basic rule, there's also many deviations, but as a basic rule, that the individual who has an entitlement to education, healthcare, etc. in the welfare state. But of course, the flip side of the individual entitlement is that this is collectively financed by taxes, given all the complications in the tax rule and all the various types of taxes we have. So in that sense, we have an interesting constellation between something which is actually quite individual in its perspective, at the same time as it's very collective in its perspective. And of course, the collective responsibility is then underlying this, and we can think of two main pillars in the welfare state: the social safety net, which is often highlighted as, even in some definitions, you can see the welfare state defined as having an extended social safety net. I think that, of course, it's a part of the welfare state, but defining the welfare state just by the safety net, I think, is not a good characterization or definition of the Nordic model, because the other leg or the other pillar, namely provision of services like health, care and education, which meets the standards and requirements of most people, is equally important for the Nordic welfare model. And also, if you look at the expenditure side and so on, you can see this is we're using a lot of resources on this, and we have high expectations concerning the standards in these provisions. So all of this, of course, implies that we have a large public sector. If we have a large public sector, also have a high tax burden. So that's what we all know. Let me just mention a few additional aspects, and I'll come back to one of them a number of times. It's actually an employment model in the sense that it would be very difficult to maintain such a welfare model if it's not the case that a large proportion of population is in employment, for the very simple reason that most people out of employment are entitled to some kind of social transfer, and those people who are in employment, they have income and they pay taxes. So every time you shift one person from employment, out of employment, you lose tax revenue and you have higher social expenditures. So this sensitivity of the financial base of the welfare state to the employment level is very large. And of course, the more extended the welfare state, that is, the larger taxes and the larger social benefits, then of course, the larger is this sensitivity. So it's no coincidence that the Nordic countries stand out as being the countries who have the highest employment rate, because simply put, if we did not have a high employment rate, we would have a very hard time financing our welfare model. Then of course there are many other aspects. I'll just mention them here to note that they are important. I have not time to go deep into it. The institutions, trust, social capital, etc. so on are also deeply embedded in the Nordic model and all the aspects of this. And a final point, which is often overlooked, is that people focus on the large public sector and so on, which is clearly there, but in comparative perspective, the Nordic countries stand out as having rather liberal private sectors. So if you look at all sorts of indicators of how liberal is the private sector, the Nordic countries stand out as being as liberal as the US, for instance. So we have this, sometimes also called a social market economy. On the one hand, we have the large public sector, but we realize, perhaps because we are small open economies and we know that if the private sector is not competitive, then we will have a hard time. So therefore, we have to focus on having a private sector which lives up to the conditions in a globalized market economy. Now, having said the Nordic model, of course, when you dig into the details of the Nordic model, as soon as you leave sort of the headlines, I think you get more and more surprised about all the differences. When you go into the details, there are so many differences. Tax structure, pension system, unemployment insurance, a long list, there's so many differences. So I think that's interesting that despite all these differences at a sort of more aggregate level, we look very similar and we perform sort of more or less similarly. Of course, Norway is now a bit outlier with the oil and so on, but still there's many, many similarities in performance. So I think that the message we can take away from this is that it's really the package, the overall objectives which matters, and not the details in the tax structure or in the pension system or whatever, but the package, the way the package is organized to achieve particular objectives which are related to what I already mentioned, maintaining a high living standard, reasonably equal distribution of income, and the welfare services and a social safety net which provide the social services we demand. That's really what is important. And that, of course, also underlines the point that the model is not a static model. It's not something which was defined at a certain point in time. And then the question is how to maintain that the objectives have been static, but the instruments, the way to achieve these objectives have changed over time, and they will also change when we move forward. So the big question is not can we maintain a particular arrangement, but can we maintain a society where we also in 10, 15 years can say, well, we stand out having rather high living standard, but also rather high provision of welfare services and a reasonably equal distribution of income. That is really what defines. And that brings us to the big question, at least the big question in the economics literature, that's the trade-off between efficiency and equity. Efficiency is how well performing the economy is, and equity is then the distributional profile. That's sort of the core issue in economics. Efficiency here, we can discuss also at length how to measure that. So here, efficiency is measured by per capita income, and equity is defined as from the Gini coefficient, the inequality in the distribution of disposable income, and then 1 minus Gini is then the equality in the distribution of income. So the textbook, the standard textbook would say that we have a basic question, a basic trade-off to deal with, namely that if we want more equity, which we might want for political reasons, we face a trade-off because more equity would cost on the efficiency side, because equity requires taxes and transfers, and that would harm efficiency, and therefore, if you are very ambitious with equity, you will have to accept low efficiency, and vice versa. So that's really a classical discussion, and it's ongoing, and recently it has been revived, because if you take now, I have here a cross-plot of OECD countries, and if you make a simple regression here, you find a positive correlation. There's a lot of studies where which are much more sophisticated than my dotted line here, where you impose all sorts of controls, do it for growth rates, all sorts of things, and you tend to find a positive correlation between equity and efficiency. So the question is, can one simply from that conclude that more equity will immediately lead to more growth, or some might interpret it in the other way, that more growth automatically lead to more equity? And I think this is a bit too hasty conclusion. It's also empirical evidence which raises a lot of questions about what type of policies will actually deliver this. And it's also a question whether it's really testing what the typical economics argument is saying, because the typical economic argument is saying that on the frontier of the possibility set, there'll be a trade-off. But of course, you can be way inside the opportunity set if you have bad institutions, make strange policies or whatever. So we have to make a sharp distinction whether countries are in a particular position because they have perhaps bad institutions or bad policies, or whether they are at the frontier because they're reasonably well reformed, right? Be looking at this together with a colleague of mine. It's not burden you with all the details, but doing that and estimating using some statistical methods, you can actually estimate the best practice frontier, and it looks sort of roughly like the line I put in here. And of course, it has a slope. So there is a trade-off at the best practice frontier. You can also see the Nordic countries clustered up here, and actually have a very high efficiency score. So that sort of matches the perception we have that we are pretty well-functioning economies. We have succeeded in achieving this high income level and a reasonable equal distribution of income. The US, of course, also has a high efficiency score, but has made another choice. Now, what is interesting here is, of course, that if you compare, for instance, the Nordic countries, the cluster here, with the US, we have roughly a tax burden of 50%, whereas the US has roughly a tax burden of 25%. So we have roughly the double tax burden. So if you read this typical economics text, you sort of be left with the impression, wow, if you have such much a higher tax burden, the cost in terms of efficiency must be really visible. And of course we can discuss whether you think this line is steep or not so steep. I don't think it's particularly steep. So it's widely known that countries are interesting. We have managed to put ourselves up in this northeastern corner with pretty high income and a fairly equal distribution of income. And that's why many countries point to us and try to understand what did we do and is there anything they can learn from this. As you see from this chart, of course, we should also be a bit careful when we, in our sort of inward-looking thing, always call this the Nordic model, because there's also other countries which are in this position, for instance, the Netherlands and so on. So we can, but let's be at with the Nordic perspective today. Now, looking further into this, the number of issues here, there's the two questions which are often mixed up with discussing the role of taxes and how it will affect the labor market and the economy and so on. And one is whether a tax has a distortionary effect, and the other is the particular effect of the tax on, say, labor supply or income or whatever. And if you have taxes and transfers, of course they put in a wedge between the social and the private return. So when you have an income tax, the private return to work is lower than the social return. That's a very general thing, and therefore this implies that the return to the private agent is less than the social return, and that's the distortion. So that's very general, and that would then imply that, for instance, labor supply is, when it's chosen by the private agents, is lower than what the social partner would choose, because of what is socially optimal, because socially it would be taken into account that the tax is going to be used for something. Whereas for the individual, I only look at what is left to me after taxes. Even though I know the budget constraint, it doesn't matter because I'm only one out of 7 million people. So that private thing is important to me. There's one thing I would like to footnote to put here, because I was so eager to shorten the text here, I left out the bullet saying, of course this presumes that there are no externalities, and we just talked about the environment. Of course, if there's an externality, it's the other way around. But for the labor supply literature and the income tax literature, we don't, mostly the literature does not discuss externalities, and we have And then there's a tendency that the choices of the individuals is on the low side. There's a distortion. But the other question is, how is the tax then actually affecting decisions? And actually, it's impossible to answer that question generally without knowing what the tax is going to finance, which is often forgotten in the discussion where taxes are just discussed out in the blue, but you cannot really discuss how taxes will affect, say, labor supply without knowing what the tax is financing. And it can have a crucial importance on how the tax is affecting the labor supply. And of course, this is partly, it's not the only, but that's a key to understand also the Nordic position in this graph I showed you. So here just put sort of two opposite questions. One is, of course, that if we could consider fully financed tax reform, where we say lower the marginal tax on labor supply and then increase the tax on something different. Then, of course, we know that if that tax reform leaves the same revenue, we don't have to be concerned about what the tax is financed. So that is well defined in that sense. And if we can broaden the tax base and lower marginal taxes, as was an element of the 90s Swedish tax reform, of course that can have some efficiency gains. But the bigger question when we are comparing countries is, of course, that we have very different levels of taxation. And of course, when you have different levels of taxation, you also have different levels of spending, and you also have different structures of spending. And then you cannot just say anything without knowing the structure of these things. And actually, I think it's quite an important point, and I think it's also a point where standard theory is perhaps a bit too quick. I found a quote here from a very recent survey on optimal income taxation. And they say, well, they can analyze income tax by assuming that it finances transfers, and this transfer is a so-called demi-grant, that is, every person in the population gets a fixed amount. So they analyze the optimal tax structure, assuming that the tax is financing a fixed sum paid out to each member of the population. We could do that, but we don't see that being done, so that's actually a very bad approximation, even of the social transfers in the Nordic countries, despite the dilemmas and so on, because we don't end up deeming grants. We do have transfers, but there are lots of conditions on these grants to get them. So already there we have a problem with the literature. It makes assumptions which are problematic when we're going to apply them for the big question at least, down here. If it was a fully financed tax reform, of course, it's not an issue. So that's why these two questions are, it's very important to keep them separate. And the point here is, of course, that some expenditures can strengthen labor supply, like daycare, like education, obviously, which both can affect the amount of labor supply, but also the quality in terms of productivity. But you can easily think also of expenditures which would reduce labor supply. Many countries, my own is a good or bad example of that. We had a very generous early retirement scheme, which was pretty costly. What happened? People used it, so we reduced labor supply. So we can easily think of expenditures which can go other ways, and you can also think of some expenditures which are not important for labor supply, but for other things. So just to illustrate this, and this is not nothing but an illustration to the classical textbook labor supply thing, and it's looked at how would the tax affect labor supply depending on what it's financing. So the blue line here is where you finance this transfer, which is handed out as a fixed sum to everybody. And the red one is if you finance something which is here called the general public activity, that is, what could say, the judicial system or something which does not have a direct effect on labor supply or productivity, so anything like that. And then active spending could be daycare. And I did not make an extreme case because you could come up with examples where you could actually increase labor supply. The point is that the effect of the tax on the labor supply critically depends on what is financed. And that's the major point here, and that's important to understand in Nordic countries, because both when you look at the transfer side, we have a lot of conditionalities, so it does not match the blue line here, and when you look on the spending side, we have a lot of those spendings which are here called active spending, which has an influence on labor supply or productivity or other things which are important for how the economy is performing. So there's actually a lot of theoretical examples showing that this trade-off I talked about earlier can look like this. At first, when you have some public activity, it could be education or daycare or something like that, you increase the tax to finance it, but if you have these positive effects from this, you can actually both improve equity and efficiency. But of course, at some point, the distortions kick in, and the beneficial effects of having more and more of, say, daycare, of course, that's diminishing in returns. So that would be a turning point, and eventually over here you have the traditional trade-off. The two important points here is that if you have efficient policies, of course you should be over here. It would be inoptimal to stop somewhere here under very, very general conditions, saying that you want more efficiency and you want more equity. And most people would agree on that. So you should move on. So it would be optimal to be over here. So if you look at sort of on the margin, you should not be surprised to find that there are trade-offs. Actually, if you do not find there are trade-offs, you should move further. So finding trade-offs is sort of an indication that you are on the right side of the trade-off figure here, of course. I'm not saying that you're necessarily in an optimal position because you have a trade-off. Still be off the point. But, so that's on the margin. We over here, there's a trade-off. But if we're going to compare and understand what did the welfare state do, that's really comparing this point to this point over here. So that's what's relevant when we compare countries who have different designs of the welfare state. And if the welfare state, as stressed before, there could be passive effects, it could be active effects. But here, then, if there are these active effects, then of course this could be the relevant thing in understanding why we sort of can square this efficiency and equity principle. So here just a very quick look at some numbers. This is the size, this is the gross expenditures as a share of GDP. I took them just to stress that the size of the public sector in the Nordic countries is actually often exaggerated because we compare gross figures. And that's not trivial because the Nordic countries, compared to most other countries, have a gross principle that we pay our transfers which are taxable income. Of course, if you tomorrow made a reform where all transfers were not taxable income and were reduced accordingly, then the tax burden will fall. So when you compare countries which have a gross principle with countries who have a net principle, you should be careful. And the red one is on the net principle. So you can see that the differences are not that big, but there are some differences still. What is actually more interesting is when we look at the structure, and here you have the public consumption and you have the collective part, so that's the classical public sector activities, and what is called the individual here is really what we usually would associate with the services. Care, childcare, old age care, health and education. Where we really stand out is that we have much more expenditures on these types of activities, which of course are important from a welfare perspective, but some of them can also be important in supporting labor supply, for instance daycare and female labor supply, education, productivity and so on. So we have more active spending, so it's not this idea that the welfare state is sort of working against markets is really not a good characterization. Now there's a lot of empirical literature on this issue, because obviously it's so important. How does the public sector affect economic performance? And there are many issues here. I don't have time to go into it. There was an earlier literature, I call it here Mark 1, which basically made simple cross-country comparisons. And if you look, there were more than 100 studies. If you looked at them, the basic conclusion was you can tell nothing. Some would show a slightly positive effect, some a negative effect, some none. So the consensus was that there was not really clear evidence on anything here. More recent literature is more sophisticated, both econometrically but also conceptually, in saying that we cannot just look at one expenditure item or one tax item, because we have to think about the budget constraint, the relationship between the taxes and what they're financing. And we also have then to distinguish between these effects which the expenditures and the taxes can have, active, passive spending. Some taxes can be highly distortionary, some will be less distortionary. So that has to be taken into account in the empirical work. And doing that, I tried to summarize it here by table, is that you find that, of course, the answer depends. It depends if you finance with the least distortionary taxes, it could be property taxes, for instance, and you finance something which has a very positive effect on labor supply, say, then it would be positive for economic performance. If you have something which is highly distortionary and passive, of course it would have a negative effect. To just underline this point, you cannot make general statements about the size of the public sector and economic performance. You have to take into account what is the structure and what is it financing and how does that affect the economy. I've already mentioned that our welfare system is very employment conditioned due to this double effect of the transfers and the taxes here. This shows the budget sensitivity of the Nordic countries to a change in employment of 1%, and you can see we have budgets which are much more sensitive to that than the OECD average, which is this line. So it just stresses this, that if we are not successful in maintaining high employment, we will have problems. And that applies, of course, we see that in the business cycle, that changes in employment will have huge budget effect, but of course it also applies structurally. If we have a low structural employment rate, we will have problems. And as we all know, employment rates are actually quite high in the Nordic countries. You have here 8, and you have the Nordic countries, and the green line is the maximum employment rate for any age group you see in the OECD, and the purple one here is the lowest. So we can see the Nordic countries is not defining the top, but very close to the top. We are a little lower here in entry, which is partly due to the fact that we educate slightly more, but actually also part to the fact that on average we are a bit slow in completing our education. So there's some scope for improvement here in most Nordic countries. And then we have the retirement thing here. We can also see that we tend to retire a bit earlier than at least the maximum here. So there's also has no scope for doing something here. And that's also what we see in all the discussion about reforms and to do all sorts of things when you look about youth, education, integration, sickness pay, unemployment insurance, etc., etc. When it boils down, you can see that at the end of the day there is this question of how to affect labor supply and employment, because that's crucial for the contribution or the effect on the public budget. So that's why all these things are so much discussed all the time. Yeah, I just put this point that it's much easier to affect labor supply on the extensive margin, that is participate or not participate, than on the intensive, which is ours, for the simple reason that you can make the social safety net conditional on participation and requirements to participate and so on, but it's more difficult to do it on the hours. And that's a dilemma in the Nordic countries, because we can see we have high employment rates, but our working hours are not equally high. And then on these entitlements, I already mentioned that this perception that it's a passive system is not a very good characterization. We have a lot of conditionalities, and they have basically an employment focus. You have to be available, you have to actually search job. There might be programs you have to participate in, which has a purpose of enhancing your job, finding possibilities, etc., etc. So these are not passive in that sense. You just sort of give people money and then say go away. There's all these requirements in it, and we usually call them the active labor market policy. And if you look at all the Nordic countries, active labor market policies are important. And they're also resource demanding, but you can also see a lot of changes, more or less all the time, changes in this, and that's of course because it's important and because it's not so easy to have this work in the right way, such that you both have the safety, the social safety on the one hand, but also maintaining incentive structure and make people actually search for jobs. But I think this is very important, that we have this sort of duality. That is not, you cannot just judge the effect of the social safety net by looking at the generosity of the transfers. You have to look at the conditions or the conditionalities in the scheme at the same time. And we do have relatively generous transfers compared to most OECD countries, but we also have more conditions. And of course the conditions are there such that we don't have people just being passive on transfers. And I just took this figure, which is from very, very basic model. It's a type of labor market model which people usually use when they discuss the design of unemployment insurance and discuss the incentive effect of unemployment insurance. And in those moments, you also see that when you build in conditionalities, that can be a way to incentivize people to look for jobs. And there's a trade-off that if you have very or relatively generous transfers up here, then the more, out here, then the more you have these conditionalities in the system, you can have the same employment rate. So these, for instance, the red line here shows combination of replacement rate and conditionalities which will deliver the same employment rate. So saying that if you want to be generous here, you have to put in more conditions. And that's by and large what we have been doing. Again, I stress there's many issues to discuss here, and there's always a discussion, can we do this better? Because it has this effect, but on the other hand, it's also very resource demanding. So it's not a trivial question of getting this to work. Then there's one particular issue on the high taxes, and also a discussion which has been ongoing, namely that there's much focus on making work pay. What is the gain from finding a job? And of course, this is a question of the difference between what you have if you have a job, wage minus tax, and what you get if you don't have a job, that's a transfer. So that's really the difference here depends on the so-called marginal effective tax rate. Right. So there's a lot of effort trying to reduce the marginal effective tax rate to make work pay. And of course there's an incentive issue to that. But then if you go to another discussion which has been very active after the financial crisis, and everybody agree, and institutions like the OECD, IMF, and you say automatic stabilizers are extremely important. And we need to strengthen the automatic stabilizers because they are there when we need them, and we saw during the crisis that they worked, and in some countries they should have been stronger. Then what generates the automatic stabilizers is actually the same thing. Because the automatic stabilizer is how the budget responds when the economy moves up or down. And that basically depends on how when income changes, how tax revenue is affected, and how transfers are changing. So you can actually show that the net effect on the budget is the change in employment of a large share of the automatic stabilizer, not 100%, but a large share of the automatic stabilizer is the change in the employment times the marginal effective tax rate. So we have a paradox in the discussion that when we discuss labor market and sort of micro aspects, we say make work pay, reduce marginal effective tax rates. When we discuss macro, we say, well, strengthen the automatic stabilizers. That goes in precisely the opposite direction. So perhaps, or the point here is that perhaps in some of this discussion which has been going on, there's been too much focus on the incentive side, and we forgot the insurance or the automatic stabilizer side. And some countries have, as a side consequence, perhaps said it was not by design, but a side consequence of reforms made, automatic stabilizers have been weakened, and therefore there's less insurance in the scheme. And now we see a lot of discussion about how to strengthen insurance, the social pillar, which I mentioned earlier in the EU and so on. Yeah. So this just to show that when you take the standard measures of the automatic stabilizer, very closely correlated with the participation tax. Here it's only this is the most complicated concept because it depends on your situation, so here it's for simple concepts and so on. And it's well established that the automatic stabilizers, they're word of their name, they are automatic and they stabilize the economy, they stabilize income for unemployed, they stabilize income distribution, and they stabilize the macroeconomy. Now then coming back to equity, inequality, and the role of the welfare state. When we discuss inequality, the general perception is that we have low inequality because we redistribute quite a lot, taxes and transfer. And we do redistribute, but it's actually only half the story. If you look up here, you have the green line is the difference in percentage in inequality to the OECD average. So you have Sweden here, and you have Norway and Denmark here. So we have lower inequality, therefore you have a negative side here. Now it's split in two components, namely the red one, which is redistribution via taxes and transfers, and the other is the inequality, which is already there in market, where people, so to speak, return from work. And you can see for Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, it's a 50-50 split. So yes, we do redistribute, and that accounts for some, or it's part of the reason why we have low inequality. But it's equally important that when people return from work, actually the distribution of income is already quite equal in comparative perspective. Why? Because we have a large share of population in the labor market, and most, they get a decent wage. That is, we have very, very few working poor. So that's pointing out that this active dimension, namely ensuring that many people are in the labor market, have a job, and get a decent wage, is as important for inequality of distribution as is the passive, classical type of redistribution. And I think that's important in a forward perspective, because the passive redistribution is under pressure, budgets under pressure, and so on. But the active instruments to affect distribution are there, and they can be used. Of course, they are also threatened by something. One thing is that, maybe it's not the most pedagogical figure here, but the Nordic countries here, we have a relatively large share of young cohorts who are low educated, despite that the Nordic countries are the countries in the OECD having the highest public expenditures on education. So one can say that if we have a large share of young people we bring into the labor market with low qualifications, we would have difficulties for them either finding a job or finding a job with a decent wage. So that's definitely one point where there's a lot of scope for improvement. Yeah, so to conclude, the structure of the public sector is as, if not more important than the sheer size. You have to look into the finer details to be able to make statements about how the public sector and the taxes will affect the economy. And this distinction between the active and the passive part, both on the distribution side and on the spending side, is extremely crucial. And I claim that one reason why the Nordic countries have been in this northeastern position is that we have a strong element of active elements, both on the spending side and on the distribution side. But of course we are facing a lot of challenges. I did not have time to go into them. I just listed some of them here to bring it up here to say that they are different in nature. Not all of them are threats to the principles of the model, even though they might require policy changes. And we have also seen new solutions. Sweden and Denmark are examples of having designed pension schemes which handle the demographic burden. There are many details which can be discussed, but in international comparison they stand out. And we have sort of found new solutions to these problems, stressing the point that it's not a static model, perhaps also stressing that part of the story is that the reform capacity, even though as economists we routinely complain about policymakers not being quick enough and so on to undertake reform, then yet reforms have been undertaken, and that helps explain why we are in that position. Thank you for your attention.